Alrighty, here is blinker number 3, serial number 3, and it's casting goo. So this is the second pour that I've just done. The first pour was just to set a 6mm layer across the bottom. Now I've done a pour, I put the electronics in and then did a pour sort of around them. So I'm stepping up in about 10mm depths. It's a little bit iffy because the capacitor volume is in there and other stuff, but about that. So I'm not using the garbage Pro-Type resin, the polyester resin. I'm using this Platinum Ultra Clear. It's actually made down the road, and it's a epoxy resin. I don't know what it is chemically, but it smells a hell of a lot better. And I got some disposable syringes and measured it out, and then carefully weighed it and got the density for it, because it's much easier to measure by mass, but the instructions say to measure by volume, so sort of fudged a bit. I crunched my numbers and they came out to, they're about the same density, part A and part B. I just copied the numbers from the carefully syringe measured ones for the second pour. So far so good. So fingers crossed this does not explode. So you see it's still blinking from when I had it out in the sun this morning, doing a test of the fully assembled one. This is the one with the slightly cracked solar panel. You can barely even see it, so it might still work. It definitely does still work, but it might not have any sort of reduced performance. Fingers crossed. So the box I'm casting in is cut on laser cutter, because you know when you've got a laser cutter and everything looks like something that should be laser cut. So I was able to set the exact dimensions I needed and cut it out. And so the inside has 3 coats of this PVA wood glue, and then it's got a piece of baking paper, and I laser cut the baking paper to fit exactly, of course, which gave me the idea you could laser cut baking paper for lining cake tins exactly right. Like, you cut out a perfect 200mm diameter circle for the bottom of your cake tin. I got very excited about that prospect. So I went with the PVA this time rather than the Vaseline or the beeswax that I used for lining that one, because I found that the Vaseline or the beeswax melted in the heat, and when in this case, you generate a bit of heat, it melts the release agent, and a little bit of it can flow over the top of the intermediate layer, and then when you go to pour the final layer, you've got this release agent trapped between 2 layers, which causes problems. So I poured the first layer with nothing in it at 1426, and then I poured the next one at 1941, so like 3.5 hours later. Hope I did that math right. And there was no appreciable shrinkage of the first layer. Like, it was still hard up against the edges of the container, so I didn't get the case where the resin would flow down and you end up with this sort of thin layer of resin over the top of another one, because that was another problem with the old method, is that when the resin started to shrink away, sometimes it would pull some of the release agent off and it would stick to the side of the resin, and then when you pour, you get your first pour layer of release agent and then your second pour on the outside, and it just doesn't adhere because the release agent is doing its job. So this stuff is initial cure 5 hours, full cure 24 hours. So I'm hoping to do a pour every 3 hours or so, to get this fully in. Like, I need to let it get all of its heat out of its system between each pour, but I don't really want to let it set completely so I get a good bond between subsequent layers. But I don't know. This is a learning process. So I'm going to cover this up and set in line for 3 hours and come back and do another one just before bed. Okay, bye bye.